Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm reviewing Detective Comics, Dark Knight Detective Volumes 1 through 8 this time, and I have my big stack of Detective Comics, all borrowed from the library, except for Volume 8, which I have here. There it is, Volume 8. But we'll get there. This is done in celebration of Volume 8's release this Tuesday, November 28th, which I purchased at my local comic shop, Mind's Eye Comics. No, sorry, that's not Mind's Eye. It's Rockhammer Comics and Games. I was not able to get all the books at the library. I didn't get volumes 1 or 2. Both of them are listed as lost in the library system. And so I read Volume 1 on DC Universe Infinite Ultra, and I read Volume 2 on my Kindle. I own the Kindle version of this, purchased when it went on sale when it first came out. And so let's start with Volume 1, which I don't have a hard copy of. Volume 1 was one of the best. A lot of stories by Mike W. Barr and Alan Davis. It starts in 1986, so this basically starts right after Infinite Crisis and Batman Year One, and it goes from this series of 8 volumes goes from 1986 to 1992, 6 years of comics, and a lot of different writers and artists contributed to this series. This had a really nice Catwoman and Joker story. Sadly, it's one of those stories where Catwoman and Batman are in love. Catwoman knows Bruce's identity, but then Joker brainwashes her into not knowing. This was, I think, one of the last appearances of her great purple suit and green cape costume, which I think is really fun and whimsical. But it was replaced later on with the David Mazzucchelli gray suit. It's very much of its time. It's very short, and it definitely gets a bunch of like needed plot stuff done, but it's really enjoyable. This first volume also is the only volume that has any real Jason Todd, and he's in a lot of these stories, and it's really heartbreaking how much Bruce loves Jason and how much Jason cares about Bruce. It's not super unique. This is basically written, I think, with Jason as the default Robin. Is Jason Todd not as Dick 2.0 like he was before Crisis? He has his own origin now, but he has a similar I'm the lightness to Batman's darkness. There's a strong bond between us. We work well together. It doesn't have that later stuff that you'd see in the Second Chances Max Allan Collins and then the Jim Starlin run that eventually killed Jason off. So there's I don't know. It's interesting to see Jason being kind of generic, but also kind of nice, because I do love that Batman and Robin dynamic where Batman is kind of dark and Robin is light. There's also an anniversary issue in Volume 1 in which Batman teams up with Slam Bradley, the Elongated Man, and Sherlock Holmes. And this is Sherlock Holmes still alive through use of royal jelly and longevity formula and all that kind of stuff. Classic Sherlock Holmes fanfic, if you know the lore of Sherlock Holmes fanfic. I personally am not a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes without Watson, although they do have a granddaughter of Watson. But this was well done. A little tongue-in-cheek, not like a... I wouldn't say this is a standout of all time, but when you look at something like Detective Comics number 1000 and Detective Comics number 1027, this is definitely a worthwhile anniversary, very fun, very much in the same vein. The inclusion of Slam Bradley as the first detective in Detective Comics and Elongated Man as a detective, and of course the grandfather of detective fiction as we know it today. Of course, there were detectives before that in like Charles Dickens and pulp literature and French, and of course Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. But Sherlock Holmes is the one that codified the tropes and that most people have read, and I think is probably best done of those early things as a detective. He crystallizes what we think of as detective fiction in a way that the contemporaries and rivals and predecessors don't really do. And it even has a G.K. Chesterton quote, which was very nice. The collection ends off with a story about an actor who becomes a second Two-Face, which I'm kind of bummed. I've never heard of this guy before, because like a dual Two-Face, pun intended, is kind of perfect for Two-Face's thing of being obsessed with twos and duplicates and stuff. But despite all the knockoff Jokers, knockoff other villains, knockoff Clayfaces, there's so many Clayfaces, this one didn't seem to stick. However, this first volume, very much worth reading. Really wish that it wasn't out of print and going for $100 or more per copy. Volume 2, I have, as I mentioned, on Kindle, and I bought it because it has the Detective Comics Annual number 2. Now, I did purchase Detective Comics Annual number 2 in single issue, and as you can see, it is signed by the artist Klaus Janson. I really wanted to get this signed by Denny O'Neil, but he unfortunately canceled at the con that I was going to attend, and of course passed away before I had another chance to see him. It is one of my favorite Batman stories of all time. It's a Talia, Batman, Penguin, Question, Lady Shiva story, and it handles all those characters really well. It's actually the first part in 3 parts, but it really sort of, the Batman stuff is really well done on its own, and it comes to a beautiful, heartbreaking conclusion. And it's one of the only things where I actually feel the power of Batman and Talia's love. I normally don't, partly because I was introduced to Talia mostly through Grant Morrison's run, and that run is very crummy if you want to like Talia. If you don't like Talia already, it confirms your prejudices. If you don't know Talia, as I can prove, it doesn't make you a fan of her. I'm still not a huge fan of her, but this issue is the closest I come to really digging her stuff. I would argue that annual is worth the cover price of the issue because they do a good job restoring the art. The art in my individual copy is not great. I mean, I'm not a graded guy. I buy to read, but this is so fragile and kind of time damaged, and it's just not a great reading copy. So the digital copy, or if you could get the trade for a reasonable price, like cover price, which is about $30-40, that's not bad. Again, this one, like volume 1, is going for about $100 a copy. Not worth it. The rest of this is mostly from Alan Grant, art by Norm Breyfogle. Really great art. I love both Norm Breyfogle and Jim Aparo, who do the art for most of these collections. Really good. Kind of wish they'd been able to do stories that had kind of, I don't know. They're really good. I think they stand up next to other greats like Graham Nolan and Eduardo Pensica. Well, he didn't really do a lot of a detective. I'm trying to think of detective. Eddie Barrows. That's who I was trying to think. Eddie Barrows, Alvaro Martinez, who did the James Tynion run. Definitely next to someone like, I want to say Brad Walker, who did a bunch of the Peter Tomasi run recently. So I think that Norm Breyfogle and Jim Aparo definitely stand up. They've got some really characteristic things that they always do that other people don't do, and so they really stick out as stylistic flourishes. This second volume introduces a bunch of, this is almost like a James Tynion Batman collection, because Alan Grant just goes crazy creating characters. He creates Ventriloquist, he creates Ratcatcher, he brings back Poison Ivy, and he creates the Corroding Man. There's a couple of misses. There's some weird Siraki, that's like Syria, Iraq combination country, where they hadn't created Umak or Kandak, or there's a couple other countries that DC's created to stand in for Middle Eastern or African countries, and Eastern Europeans. Like, who's the Tara is the princess of some Eastern European country, but Iraq is not a country that's lasted because it's a little too goofy. Although UMEC stands for Unnamed Middle Eastern Country, so that's not much less goofy, but it sounds more like a real country than Iraq. And there's an Aborigine vigilante that feels really shallow. But in general, Grant really steps up to the plate, creates a lot of fun horror/noir stories that really highlight the villains and Batman's role in it. And I think Grant is a really good writer. I don't like him quite as much as Chuck Dixon, but he definitely was really strong. especially compared to some of the other writers that we're going to see coming in this collection. So volumes 1 and 2, definitely recommended. Unfortunately, they're really expensive. Volume 3 happens right after Death in the Family and Killing Joke, technically, and this is a darker Batman. A lot of darker stories, mostly by there's some Alan Grant stuff. This is volume 3. This is the only one that has a title, Blind Justice, and that's for the really long story in the back of the book, written by Sam Hamm, who's one of the writers on Batman, the movie by Tim Burton, and he also is currently writing Batman 89, the original miniseries, and then the sequel miniseries that continue the idea after Batman Returns. So they kind of split off from Batman Forever, which is theoretically a sequel to the Burton movies, but these are like direct sequels made by one of the same writers. I didn't really like Blind Justice. There's a lot of really kind of cliched Batman elements that you see whenever a film writer or someone who wants to be a film writer does a Batman story. They introduce a new love interest like Chase Meridian or Rachel Dawes. Like, film writers always come up with these new love interests and then they get rid of them in a really contrived way. Either they kill them off, or they write them out, or they just forget about them and they disappear between movies. It's not bad. There are good parts of it. The execution isn't terrible, but it's really cliched and we've seen it all before. And it feels a little ham-handed, pun intended. Just tons of story elements you see mashed together. There's some one-off stories by Alan Grant, like Bankers on Ecstasy, the weird psychic villain Cornelia Stark, who's like a serial killer torturer. And that was actually kind of fun. But it's not the same level of inventiveness as you had the Ratcatcher and Ventriloquist in the previous volume. Those guys have stuck around. They have a real gimmick. They can really sort of stick with Batman. So, unfortunately, I don't really recommend Volume 3. Volume 4. Nope. Sorry, these are out of order. Here's Volume 4. Volume 4. As you can see, this is the Anarchy issue. Alan Grant's back at it again. Alan Grant's, again, kind of like the James Tynion of 1991 or 1990 or 1989, just creating characters right and left. And I've been saying a lot recently, James Tynion is a Batman writer of the 1990s trapped in a millennial's body, and that's a very high compliment for me. He does have some of the same love of excess and love of Baroque plots and retcons and all kinds of wacky stuff, but I think at the heart he loves creativity, seeing Batman and his world and really embracing him, telling stories that he's good at telling. So in James Tynion's case, it's sci-fi / horror / apocalyptic stories. Whereas Grant is kind of crime stories, and with Dixon, it's noir, noir detective type stories. Grant has a gift of that too, but he's much more kind of crime focused than necessarily the detective tropes with the voiceover narration that Dixon really excels at. This has 2 longer arcs. First, Mud Pack. So we've got Clayface 1, Clayface 2, Clayface 3, and Lady Clayface all teaming up. It is not super good. It has a Looker team up from Batman and the Outsiders, which I like that character, but this doesn't give you any really distinctive stuff. It just kind of uses her powers. She doesn't have a lot of flavor in this, compared to when Chuck Dixon used her in his Batman and the Outsiders run in 2007. So that Mud Pack story really just doesn't strike my fancy. I didn't enjoy it that much. The Anarchy story was quite good. I like the Anarchy story a lot. It's very funny the way that Alan Grant clearly wanted Anarchy to be considered for Robin, because there's a little thing of Anarchy dressed up as Robin in Batman's imagination, and then he just denies it, clearly saying, no, editorial said I couldn't do it, but I wanted to. It's well done. It clearly plays to Grant's strengths in his kind of political thinking and his character creation. There's a richness and a detail to that character that I appreciate. Ends up with a funny Penguin fakes his own death and comes back to wreak vengeance, but it's in 2 issues instead of multiple years like we're seeing in the exact same plot with Chip Zdarsky and Tom King right now. So I would say Volume 4 is probably it's a 50% recommend. I don't love it as much as 1 and 2, but it's definitely better than 3. But that Mud Pack story kind of weighs it down. Volume 5. This is basically all. This is basically all Alan Grant. So it's all Alan Grant with one annual. Yeah, it's one annual by the master, Archie Goodwin, and art by great artist, very young at the time, Dan Jurgens, who was hot off of, or he was either hot off of Death of Superman or going into Death of Superman. But he did this annual, really good Batman arc, really good international. Well, I don't want to get into the annual first because it's the end of the volume and it's a good ending. But you get your first 12 issues of Batman of Detective Comics by Alan Grant, and it's very much post Jason's death darkness. A lot of situations where Batman does stuff where you're like, did he kill that guy or not? I mean, it's definitely pushing the line. We're talking about Batman throwing Two-Face's coin in Batman Forever and Two-Face jumping after it. Batman knew he would do that. There's a case where Batman throws a guy's magical emblem out of a window off a cliff, and the dude jumps after it, and Batman is just like, oh, I don't care, he died. And similar, there's a time where Batman kicks a guy off of him, and the guy and his boss both stumble into a garbage grinder and get literally wood chipped, like in Fargo. So Batman is not in a good place. I like that they don't hammer that home, but if you know what's going on, it really enriches what you're thinking about. It's funny that these issues don't come up when we talk about Batman does not kill, like the whole Batman no kill rule. I think it's evidence that Batman really does need a Robin to have something to live up to and to set a good example for. We have Catwoman and Batman versus Catman, Thomas. Is it Thomas Blake? Yeah, Thomas Blake, who Gail Simone kind of reinvented. I think she actually references this story. It's not a great story. It's very silly, but it is kind of fun. Unfortunately, we got the David Mazzucchelli Catwoman design. I'm not a huge fan of what Catwoman does, how Frank Miller uses Catwoman in Batman Year One. It's one of the few notes that I think I would have advised differently, but it doesn't ruin that story at all. I still think it's a complete masterpiece, but it's not my favorite Catwoman at all. Grant ends his part of this run with the Obia Man, sort of a Haitian voodoo story where Tim Drake's mother is killed and his father is crippled, and Tim faces anarchy. And that's a stronger story than I remember. I read it back when I read Death in the Family, A Lonely Place of Dying, and then I read the Obia Man, because they're kind of the Tim Drake trilogy. Unfortunately, it doesn't hold up as well as those other two stories. It's better than I remember. It's less stereotypical than I remember. There's a lot more richness to the depiction of Haitian characters, but it's still just kind of more dated in a way that doesn't entertain and is not as interesting as it could have been. It is still really important for Tim's story, because obviously one of his parents dies and the other is seriously injured. The ending story, as I said, by Archie Goodwin and Dan Jurgens, is really good. And interestingly, it deals with race much more interestingly, because you have a black cop who is stationed in Japan, falls in love with a Japanese woman. So there's a ton of Japanese characters, good and bad and complicated. There's a bunch of black characters. This black guy who's a cop now, he gets killed early on, and he has a lot of Japanese culture. He really embraced Japanese culture while he was in Japan in the Navy. So he's got military, cop, Japanese, black, all these cultural things going on, and they're handled, I think, with some complexity by Archie Goodwin. And then his daughter, who's I think a treasury agent, she works for the feds somehow, and she and Batman travel to Japan and get involved with the Yakuza and Japanese business, and it's just really complicated, really fun mystery, very good adventure. And I think that the way it explores race and cultural issues is really so much better than the Obia Man story. I kind of wish it came back. I feel like you could use the cop's daughter and the cop's son, her half brother, and the cop's lover, the Japanese lover, and his wife. There's so much richness you could bring back into stories. I don't know. I don't think it would work well today, but I think in a couple of years, hopefully, we'll be in a better place where writers could pick that kind of thing up. I don't think they will, but it would be cool. This one definitely gets a recommend. I think this is so basically 1 and 2 really strong, 3 not so good, 4 half good. This back to 1 and 2 level really good. Number 6, really interesting recolor of this color. The first 2 books, I think the covers were recolored by Dave Stewart, classic colorist who worked on Batwoman Elegy. That's what I really remember him from, with James Williams III. Very painterly. This one, after 2, so 3 through 8, were recolored by Alan Pasalacqua, who I really like. I'm a big fan of Alan Pasalacqua's art. Where's all right? So the cover is very funny how he recolored this book. His original art's by Michael Golden, and it's very pink. It's weirdly pink. And they knew they were using this cover for the cover. You see how weirdly pink it is, but it's very dramatic, that triangle shape and the gargoyles. But you can see when they took it, they got rid of all the pink, kept the shape, just added a much more realistic tone. And this is the way they've done all of it. The first volume 2 cover was originally an orange sunset, and they changed that to purple twilight, which I enjoy better. But a lot of people were mad. They're like, no, we must have the original Mike Mignola. I mean, it's Mike Mignola art on volume 2. So all of these have recolored things, and all the volumes 3 through 8 are all recolored by Alan Pasalacqua, who's one of my favorite colorists. I wish he was working for DC more, but I think he's moved on to other art projects. Coloring is tricky unless you're able to really get a name for yourself, so you can just be consistently used like Jordi Bellaire, who has also supplemented her income with writing gigs. Volume 6. Let's take a look at my notes. So this opens with Suicide Squad's John Ostrander writing a 3-issue arc, which is hilarious. It's very meta. It's an indie comics artist-writer writes a Batman comic, but obviously he doesn't know anything about Bruce Wayne, so he makes Batman this demon-possessed, a guy who makes a literal deal with a bat devil, and then he's got a Batgirl who's just a pure girl trying to help him out, and he's got a Joker who's a demon-possessed clown. It's just this goofy supernatural, pure 90s schlock from the stuff that made Image famous. This, of course, would be a concept that was done metatextually throughout Batman Knightfall with Azrael, who's another pure 90s edge character. This is just concentrated down to 3 issues. I thought it was hilarious. I really enjoyed it. The ending was a little annoying. Got a political thing that didn't have much thought put into it, but just sort of puts controversial topics in your face without any real purpose for that. Then we get back to Alan Grant, who introduces Abattoir, who's a very important character for the Knightfall storyline. And then, unfortunately, Marv Wolfman takes over. Marv Wolfman has done, of course, genre-defining things like his New Titans and Teen Titans and Titans runs, and the creation of Deathstroke, creation of Terra, all these things, turning Dick Grayson into Nightwing with George Perez. Lots of classic writing, very skilled. I love his recent Man and Superman origin story that was finally published. There's sort of an inventory issue when the series Superman Confidential was ended, and they finally published it as a one-shot graphic novel, and it's quite good. I really appreciate it. But these stories feel like Wolfman had stories, and he just kept writing, and he didn't take note of where pages were, and so he has to wrap the story up on one page, and it's just very unsatisfying. He does this consistently. Some of his skill shows up in the introduction of consistent new ongoing characters like Dana Hanrahan, who's a cop who works alongside Jim and Sarah Gordon, but it's just not great. Then we get to another anniversary issue. So Detective Comics 627. So the Detective Comics 600 was in volume 1 of the series. In volume 6, we finally get to Detective Comics 627, I think. And we've got a retelling of Detective Comics 27, the first Batman story, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. 2 retellings, one by Marv Wolfman, and he ties in his ongoing characters and plots to that with an election of the mayor, and is very violent. Lots of people being melted by chemicals. It's very gross and grim, very similar to the original, which is quite dark and grim as well. And then Alan Grant does kind of more of a metatextual, symbolic celebration of Batman's characters with a big spread of all the heroes and villains connected to Batman in the last several years. I think they're both fun. Brad Neltzer did this for the New 52 recently, and it's an interesting thing. like Detective Comics 27 or Detective Comics 1000 or Detective Comics 1027. It's not super memorable, but it is fun. It's a fun artifact. And then after Woolman's run, we've got Peter Milligan's run. Peter Milligan clearly didn't really care about Batman. Batman is almost always an afterthought to the stories he's telling. It's just a bunch of random horror stories, like grass that possesses people to take revenge for ancient crimes. Siamese twins of different races as mob bosses. Holocaust golems. It's ridiculous stuff that's never tied into Batman very much. The characters aren't very engaging. It's dark. It's depressing. It's not enjoyable. The art is fine. I think it's still Aparo or Breyfogle. Really good art, but Milligan was not a good choice for this book. And I have zero desire to read Dark Knight, Dark City and the Origin of Barbados now because of this. If it's more of this, I would really like to be writing horror, but I am forced to write Batman to pay the bills. I'm not interested. Volume 7, second to last. We have a little bit of a step up, kind of some fill-ins. Kelly Puckett, who was assistant editor at the time, and would go on to write Batgirl with Cassandra Cain. He was he's not actually technically a creator, but he is the person who defined her character because he wrote her series for 3 years. And he writes 2 wacky crime-solving ladies teaming up with Batman. It's kind of funny. It's a silly little story, but I think it's fun. Legendary writer Louise Simonson writes 4 issues for this arc, an annual, which is kind of a future state. Before Batman Beyond, she did Batman in the future, and unfortunately everyone dies, so it's not great, but it was interesting. And then her 3 issues of the regular series are like a painfully boomer take on video games. She's just, video games could be addictive, and then someone who's psychic could use video games to create monsters in the real world. And it is just so silly and not very well thought through. I didn't enjoy that plot very much. I did like the way she was writing Jim Gordon and Sarah Essen, who are dating and clearly very much in love. They're very, very sweet. They're working out together. They're solving crimes together. They got a really good rapport going on. The way they're drawn, they run. Jim runs backwards to show off for her. It's just sweet. Louise Simonson definitely writes some of the best Jim and Sarah dynamic that I've read, and I really love them. There's a little bit of lecturing. Jim Gordon has a heart attack after coughing while smoking a lot, so they're like, kids, smoking is bad. It's funny how that comes and goes. I definitely agree, smoking is bad, but it's kind of lectury and after school specialty in these comics, and it doesn't feel as natural as it could be. Kind of hard to deal with when you're coming from an era where literally everyone smoked and everything was full of cigarette smoke, and sometimes people thought cigarettes were good for your health. And now we have so much more knowledge, and so it's tricky. We've gone through such a change in our view of cigarettes. I think nowadays it's less of a concern. People don't feel like they need to lecture people, but I'm sure we'll swing around to lectures and TV shows and comics again. I remember a comic with Spider-Man and the X-Men about the dangers of smoking with a supervillain who is smoking, and they have to tell him, smoking, you don't have to smoke. It'll be okay. And he becomes a reformed man. It's so silly. But I didn't have a lot of comic books as a kid, so I thought it was super cool. Alan Grant and Denny O'Neil do a very interesting crossover that closes out the story. No, it doesn't close out. It's the second last 3 issues from 3 different series: Batman, Legends of the Dark Knight, and Detective Comics 3 issues. Design work was done by Anton Furst, who worked on the Batman movie with Tim Burton. He did a lot of the sort of architecture, and it's an architecture story that really reminds me of both Gates of Gotham by Scott Snyder, Kyle Higgins, and Trevor McCarthy, and Dustin Nguyen for 1 issue, and then Death by Design by Chip Kidd. I can't remember if he was writer and drawer of that, but Chip Kidd is a big thing. It was very gorgeous art, but the story again was sort of like a movie thing. Disposable love interest, just not great, but that book was jaw-dropping to look at. It's fun. If you know Batman history, it's fun to see this kind of story. I did not like the last story, which was basically Psycho with a librarian instead of a hotel owner as Norman Bates, who's obsessed with his mother, serial killing people. Just not good. I am so glad that Milligan was off the book after this and he wasn't included in the next volume. Lastly, we have Detective Comics, The Dark Knight Detective Volume 8. This is the finale of the series. The next issue of Detective Comics after this is part of Prelude to Knightfall, or Road to Knightfall. This takes us right up to the Bane era, and it's the start of Chuck Dixon's run. He does, I think, about 10 issues in this run, and the other pieces, they reprint the Simonson annual at the beginning because they made an error in the last volume. So instead of reprinting that volume correctly, they just put it in here, making it oversized, and I wish they hadn't because it feels stuffed, and they eliminated some of the things they normally do for this volume. It's a nice story. I don't regret having it, but if you had the whole volume, it would be really annoying to get both of them. There's another annual by Ellen Grant, and that one is part of the Eclipso crossover, where that evil black gem creates demons out of rage of people, and is a bit silly, but it's got some fun Jim Gordon stuff. But of course, the big thing that I love about this is the start of Chuck Dixon's run. Chuck Dixon starts off with not necessarily a bang, but a really strong stylistic statement. His first 6 issues are with artist Tom Lyle, who also did the Robins miniseries that he did with Tim Drake at the same time. And Tom Lyle's not the best artist, but he's very good. He's not great at appeal. His hairstyles are very dated, but he has a strong sense of composition, and he's a very good storyteller. He passed away a few years ago, and one of his students, Paulina Ganeshow, did a Batgirl's 90 homage, and this is part of this run. This is an homage to one of the pages in Detective Comics starting to Volume 8. So I pulled this out to show that his legacy, Tom Lyle, carries on. I love this cover. It is basically a 30-year homage to Stephanie Brown's creation and one of her co-creators, Tom Lyle. I treasure this issue, and I treasure the fact that I now have Dark Knight Detective Volume 8 to have the whole of Stephanie Brown's origin. But of course, we also have a fun electrocutioner arc that is Chuck Dixon's first story in Detective Comics. He then does the Stephanie Brown origin, which is a great teen noir. So the first one is kind of like a crime. So it's mostly from the criminal's perspective, got that noir crime story. The second one is much more objective. It doesn't have the same personal point of view, but Stephanie Brown and Tim Drake and Batman's voices are really nuanced and thoughtful. Oh, and in the Electrocutioner issue, actually, because Jim Gordon is involved in the justice system, he's a target of the electric killer. And that crisis brings him to propose finally to Sarah Essen Gordon. And that's really sweet. After those 2 arcs, that's 6 issues, we have the start of Graham Nolan's run. Graham Nolan on art is really good. And he has an issue about, we start with, what's his name? Harvey Bullock. So there's an issue where Harvey Bullock is just from his perspective. It's classic noir, classic private detective, even though he's a cop because he acts like a private detective. It has the texture of his neighborhood, his daily routine, his feelings about Batman. He goes through an arc where he doesn't like Batman very much, and then he ends up liking Batman more. So that's kind of fun. Apparently, it was adapted to Batman the Animated Series. It's just a really solid 1-issue arc of Detective Comics. And then we go into Huntress, and where Harvey Dent is the private detective who works for the cops and has his gumshoe hat and is kind of a slob. Huntress is a former mafia princess, and Dixon retcons a bunch of her stuff to put her in Gotham from the original kind of messy and stereotypical and really forgettable, in my opinion, 1980s miniseries that made Helena Bertinelli different than Helena Wayne. She is the narrator of this book. She's on the outs with Batman, and she's very she just has a really strong voice. Her costume is very silly. They're still working. They don't get to the full body black and purple. So this is more of a very small leotard with deep cleavage. But she's got the same skills and hard attitude and good detective work. She drives a Lamborghini, which is a big thing that people like because she does still have some mafia money, although that comes and goes. It's people don't really pay attention to that stuff, unfortunately. But Huntress is great. I love seeing her here. I'm glad that both of issues of her crossover are the last issues of this volume. And Graham Nolan draws her really well. I wanted to show I actually had these Detective Comics issues of Stephanie Brown's origin, of course, and it came in a lot of 10. So I also have this great Detective Comics number 650, which is the first Nolan issue, Graham Nolan, Dixon Nolan, and it's a Harold Allnut, the tech guy in the cave. He's a mute who's got a hunched back, but he's also just sweet and hardworking and brilliant and creates so much tech. And he goes spelunking this issue. So it's a him adventure story with Ace the Bat Hound a little bit. He just walks around. He discovers the tunnels are connected to the Bat Cave, the subway tunnels. So it's just fantastic. Volume 8, I'm so happy to have this in my collection. Even though I have some of these single issues, the art restoration is really good. Even though the lettering is not so good, there's some missing ink and stuff that feels like they kind of scanned it and then took out some of the intensity, so it didn't look overprinted, but kind of underprinted as a result. Still, volume 8 joins volumes 1, 2, and 5 as my highlights. So 1, 2, 5, and 8 are my highlights, and those I recommend, especially 8. If you get 1 and 2, they're actually really, really good, but they're so expensive that I don't know how highly I can recommend them. And number 5 is just really good. Alan Grant's most uninterrupted run with a really great annual at the end by Archie Goodwin and Dan Jurgens. So that's my review of Detective Comics Collections Dark Knight Detective Volumes 1 through 8. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you might check these out if you haven't heard of them. I really recommend getting to know Stephanie Brown from the beginning. We're going to be getting the Tim Drake Robin Compendium Volume 1 in June of 2024, next year. And hopefully people will really discover Stephanie Brown in those because she's in several stories. Depending on how far it goes, she's in a lot of really good stories in that too. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm hoping that they'll continue doing Tim Drake Compendium so we can really get that early Tim Drake and Stephanie Brown, and we'll get some fans back because the New 52 was really terrible for Tim. He was ignored in favor of Damian Wayne and Jason Todd and Dick Grayson. He was in the Teen Titans, but that run is not popular. And I think getting those 90 stories by Chuck Dixon back on the shelves and back in readers' hands will develop a whole new fan base for both Tim and Steph, who's a huge part of that series, starting in like the 30s and 40s of Robin. So this has been a review. Thanks for sticking with me. Let me know if you enjoyed these books or if you have any other recommendations. Have a great night.